Hi everyone. This is the first of a pair of lectures dealing with biological invasions, with a specific focus on alien plant species in South Africa. I've chosen to start with this image because it shows a very invaded patch of fynbos. So invaded, in fact, that the unique structure, richness, composition, and functioning of that area has been completely and possibly permanently lost. In this lecture, we're going to go over some fundamentals, starting with the definitions of alien invasive species and a description of the invasion process. Thereafter, we will look at the broad impacts of biological invasions and try to understand why some species are more likely to become invasive and why some ecosystems are more likely to become invaded. Throughout, I'll be using South African examples to illustrate the content and theories that we are working through together. Okay, so there are 5 descriptions I think we all need to understand and agree on for us to be able to talk about biological invasions efficiently. Let's start with the most important 3. First, an alien species is any species whose presence in an area is due to humans having transported it to that area. In other words, having introduced it to a new part of its range or a new habitat. If a plant colonized a different country or continent without human assistance, then that is just natural colonization. However, if it's humans that moved the plant, whether on purpose or whether accidentally, then it becomes an alien species. If that alien species is able to reproduce and sustain its own population without humans interfering, then we would upgrade its status to being a naturalized plant. Finally, when a naturalized plant species is able to spread far beyond its original introduction site, then we consider it an invasive species. There are some guidelines as to what constitutes having spread far enough to be considered invasive. But what you can see from them basically is that it doesn't require the species to move very far at all, just to be doing so without intentional human transport. It's important to note that while these definitions are widely accepted, there are some scientists who argue for slightly different classifications. For example, these definitions don't include an explicit requirement for having a negative impact on the environment or on the economy. But some researchers would argue that we should only call an alien species invasive when it does have a negative impact. Okay? We are sticking with the definition we've listed here that doesn't require a negative impact, but just be aware that there are some slightly different definitions. 2 other terms we need to clarify. So, weeds are any plants, indigenous or alien, that are growing where they're not wanted. And at these sites, they're having some negative ecological or economic impact. So this can range from native species growing in gardens where they're not wanted, the whole way to alien species affecting the provisioning of ecosystem services or threatening the conservation of species. We can also sometimes talk about invasive transformers. Now, these are a subset of invasive species. In other words, only some invaders are invasive transformers. And we classify them as an invasive transformer when they strongly alter a large portion of an ecosystem. This would, for example, include alien prickly pear cacti invading large parts of the Namakuru, totally changing the structure and the functioning of that ecosystem. Or it could be alien trees like wattles in the grasslands, which invade these areas and change the dominant growth form and the species richness over huge areas. We can visualize these relationships in a schematic like this. So, some alien species which are able to sustain their own populations without human help are naturalized species. Okay, so all naturalized species are also alien species, but only some alien species are naturalized. Similarly, some naturalized species are able to spread far from their initial introduction site and are then invasive species. with all invasive species also necessarily being naturalized. There's even a smaller subset of alien species, the transformers, which are only the invasive species that strongly alter ecosystems. And finally, we can also overlay weeds on the schematic. Weeds then, on the other hand, are invasive, can be alien or indigenous species, and can include everything from alien species which need human assistance to survive, to transformers which are a threat to human activities, to indigenous species which grow where we don't want them. Good. Now, with that foundation built, let's think about the process of biological invasions. So, a useful way to think about invasions is in terms of the barriers that a species must cross or must overcome to become an alien, then to become naturalized, and then finally to become invasive. I'll show you two schematic diagrams illustrating this process in the next two slides. But let's first try to talk through it. The first barrier to becoming invasive is a transport barrier. In other words, humans need to move a species to an area where it does not naturally occur. Usually this means transporting seeds or mature plants to another continent or country, across an ocean or a large mountain range, or even across an area just with very unsuitable climate. The second barrier, once the species has now crossed the transport barrier and is considered an alien, the second barrier is the species needs to escape from transportation and establish in the new conditions. It might be as simple as a seed falling out of a suitcase of a traveler, or an alien plant species being bought from a nursery and planted in someone's garden. Part of this barrier is also that the plant needs to survive in those local conditions that it escapes to. In other words, it has to establish, and it has to stay alive long enough to reproduce. Once it's crossed that barrier, then it means the plant is naturalized. The final barrier is then the dispersal barrier. If a naturalized species is able to successfully disperse, then we consider it invasive. And here successful dispersal means that the seed or some other reproductive material must move away from the mother plant and establish and grow into a mature plant that can then also reproduce. Let's look at two diagrams that represent this. Now, this is the simpler of the two schematics. You can see here that we have our barriers as vertical lines, and that species cross different numbers of barriers are shown as horizontal arrows. And again, if you struggle with the idea of a barrier, you could also then call it a challenge, maybe. What we see illustrated here is that once a species crosses the geographic barrier, then it's considered an alien. Species then that additionally escape into and survive within local environmental conditions can be considered naturalized. So that's the two purple barriers. And then those species that further cross the dispersal barrier and survive and reproduce in environmental conditions distant from their parent plants are considered invasive. And in this schematic, the authors distinguish between dispersing into disturbed habitats and dispersing into natural habitats, but successfully establishing in either is all that's needed to be considered an invasive species. Here we have a slightly different and more complex version of the same schematic. So here, from top to bottom, we have the classification of a species in red, the stages of an invasion in green, and the barriers in blue. Then below that, we've got two interesting conceptual additions. First, we see that the species that don't cross the dispersal barrier are considered as invasion failures, which is a good thing for us. And then some species that don't quite manage to sustain populations are classed as boom and bust invasive species. These are maybe species that initially look like they're going to be successful invaders, but they never managed to develop large populations. Now, that's not very important, but what I really like on this schematic, and the reason I've included it, is the management section in yellow right at the bottom. Here, the authors have recommended broad management actions that are relevant for different stages of the invasion process. For example, if we want to prevent species from being introduced before they've even crossed the geographic barrier, we need to implement prevention measures. And this could be control of cargo and control of passengers when they enter our country to check that they are not transporting seeds intentionally or accidentally. After being introduced, however, eradication, in other words, killing all the individuals, the eradication is an option for all alien species. For naturalized aliens, we might consider containment because that's more feasible than eradication once a species is occurring at more and more sites. And containment here means specifically trying to avoid the species crossing the dispersal barrier and becoming invasive. And then for true invasive species where they have now spread far and wide, we might instead attempt mitigation rather than eradication. And mitigation here would mean we try to control the species abundance and spread to minimize the negative impacts. Because some aliens, we recognize it becomes impractical to try and eradicate them. Okay, speaking of impacts, what sort of impacts do invasive species have? And how can we go about quantifying these impacts? Now, this is a whole field almost by itself, so we're not going to go into a lot of depth, but what I do want to cover here first is a simple heuristic. In other words, a way of thinking about impacts that lets us simplify things down to a manageable level of complexity. We can say that, and we're talking very approximately here, but we can say that the impact of an invasive species is the product of its range size and its abundance or density and its effect where it occurs. So, species with large ranges and consistently high densities and large effects, for example, on grazing availability, will have a large impact because that's three large numbers multiplied by each other. In contrast, the species that has only invaded a small area and has low abundance and has a small effect on the ecosystem is going to have a limited impact, right? It's a small value for range, a small value for abundance, and a small value for effect. Let's look at two examples. On the left, we've got the prickly pear, Opuntia ficus indica, and on the right, Lantana camara. Now, the prickly pear, remember on the left, has a large range. Those symbols indicate quarter-degree squares where the species was recorded. The darker the symbols, the more intense the invasion. In other words, the higher the abundance and the density. So, the prickly pear has a large range across South Africa, but with fairly low levels of invasion, and that's due to an effective biocontrol agent. So it's large range multiplied by relatively low abundance. On the other hand, Lantana, on the right-hand side, is a much narrower distribution range, but has heavy invasion levels across pretty much its whole range. So, since both of these species have similar intensity of effects on their host ecosystems, we would predict that their total impacts are roughly similar. For Opuntia, a large range multiplied by a fairly low abundance, and for Lantana, a fairly small range multiplied by a fairly high abundance. Now, there are lots of approaches that can be followed here, but I think this is the most useful one for us for now. In terms of what sorts of effects alien species can have, well, there's a lot of documented impacts, and here I've listed some of the most common impacts. Okay, and they include, if we first look at ecosystem level effects, well, altering the abundance, the cover, and the biomass of the entire community. And of course, it does that by individually altering species, favoring some and strongly negatively impacting others. But on a whole, what we see There's changes in how many other organisms there are, how big they are. Alien species can also affect nutrient cycling, for example, by altering hydrology, by transpiring more and therefore using more moisture than native species. This is also linked with how alien species can alter the intensity and timing of disturbances. For example, by altering the fire regime or changing the intensity of soil erosion. When focusing on individual species, we can see how alien species can have negative impacts on them, including through, in the worst case, entirely displacing them. As a result of this, we may see reductions in the richness of native species, as well as changes in how species interact. For example, we can think about how alien species can change the abundance of pollinators, either by producing really showy flowers that attract pollinators, like this pom-pom weed in the bottom right, or potentially by even causing the death of pollinators. And through this, they alter pollination interactions. You can imagine how a field full of pom-pom weed could increase pollinator abundance, but also potentially attract pollinators away from less showy native species. Finally, aliens can also potentially hybridize with closely related native species, altering their genetic composition and their genetic distinctiveness. Now, what I've listed here is all maybe a little bit theoretical, so I want to read details from two examples for you from Zengai and Wilson's 2020 report about the state of biological invasions in South Africa to make things a bit more concrete. So I'm quoting here. Invasive trees use up to 3 to 5% of South Africa's surface water runoff each year. 3 to 5% of South Africa's surface water runoff, exacerbating the effects of drought. If there were no invasive trees in the city of Cape Town's catchment, day zero, the day that it was forecast the city would run out of water, day zero would have been delayed by 60 days during the peak of the water crisis in 2017. The destructive wildfires in Knysna in 2018 were exacerbated, that means made worse, by plant invasions. 15% more fuel was burnt in invaded areas than uninvaded areas, increasing the severity of fires and making containment measures ineffective. And they conclude then by saying, biological invasions are the third largest threat to South Africa's biodiversity after cultivation and land degradation, and are responsible for 25% of all biodiversity losses. Now, there's a lot more we could say about the ecological impacts of species, and in the recommended reading you can find more information. But I want to raise one other concept before we move on to the economic impacts of alien species. This concept is called invasion debt, and it's a measure of how much invasion we can still expect to occur at any one place. Invasion debt is expected everywhere because alien species at any given site are at different stages of the invasion process at a given time. So we can think, for example, about invasion debt here in Pretoria, and we'll talk through its four components. First, we have species that are still to be introduced in the future. Okay, so we are assuming that people will still intentionally and accidentally bring more species to the city, and that some of those will become invasive. Second, we have species that are already here and not currently invasive. So we can think of all our alien and naturalized species that aren't invasive. And some of these, given enough time, will become invasive. So that strange plant that is growing maybe along the side of the road and it's only one population, it might, given enough time, become invasive. And that's exactly what happened with pom-pom weed in Pretoria. Third, we can expect that invasive species that are here already will cover progressively larger areas, so their distribution and their density will increase. And finally, we can also anticipate that the negative impacts of some of the invasive species that are already here will also increase through time. So maybe, for example, we've got pom-pom in many of our reserves here, and we can assume that that pom-pom will grow denser and denser and therefore have a larger impact through time. Therefore, this concept then of invasion debt deals with the future impacts of alien species based on our current situation. And it really suggests to us how much worse the extent and the impacts of invasion could get at a given site. Another way to describe it is the time-delayed impact of invasive species. I'll say that again, the time-delayed invasion of species. Okay, so that's a valuable concept to bear in mind because it says to us, this is our current situation, but we are facing a large invasion debt. And we need to make sure that our management actions and our conservation actions aren't based on what's here now, but are based on what could happen so that we address the impacts that haven't yet happened as well as the impacts that are occurring now. Okay, so invasive species are clearly bad for our for our ecosystems, with some invasive species being much worse than others. But what about their impacts on our pockets? Unfortunately, this is bad too. We could split the economic costs of alien species into damage costs and management costs. Damage costs reflect the negative impacts of alien species, right? So what they have actually done already, how they have reduced agricultural productivity, how they have reduced ecosystem services, how they've maybe damaged infrastructure. While management costs, on the other hand, reflect the costs we incur to manage and to prevent invasion. So that would be, for example, all the measures we put in place to make sure that alien species don't arrive in South Africa, and all the management we do, for example, to try and control the numbers of species that are already invasive. And from this graph on the bottom right, you can see that management costs are increasing, damage and management costs are increasing rapidly globally, with damage costs far outweighing management costs now. In other words, we're spending more to control the invasives that are already here than we are to stop further invasions. Now, realistically, it's hard to put accurate numbers to these costs, but we are talking about in the range of hundreds of billions of dollars globally per year. So you can see it is very serious. Interestingly, much of the costs of invasive species are actually associated with invasive animal species. And here you can see on the far left, the biggest costs associated with invasive species globally are dealing with alien mosquito species. Okay, and this makes a lot of sense considering that these species are disease vectors. But this graph also makes me rather worried that at present we aren't really thinking very seriously about the consequences of plant invasions yet. This graph might look very different in 10 years from now or in 20 years from now. Okay, we'll talk about the South African context in more detail a bit later, but I do want to just here quickly talk about the costs of invasions in South Africa. So as an example of damage costs, invasive plant species reduce the value of livestock production from natural rangelands by about 340 million rand per year. Okay, so this is the influence of invasive species growing in areas where we have cattle and sheep and goats grazing. And by growing there, by reducing the abundance of the plants that those animals want to graze on, it has this big cost. And frighteningly, this cost is forecast to grow rapidly if invasions are not controlled. In terms of management costs, the South African government, and we're talking here just through spending of the Department of Forestries, Fisheries and the Environment, spend more than R1 billion per year in the last few years to control and manage invasions. So if you need to be convinced further of the severity of the situation, you can really just consider these numbers. Okay. So we now understand how serious invasions can be. But can we predict which species are going to be problematic invaders? That would obviously be very useful for guiding our management and control actions, right? If we've got a limited budget for eradicating an alien species, which one should we target? It turns out that with our current understanding of biological invasions, we can do an okay job with this. There are certain traits that can help us to forecast which alien species will become invasive. Now, this is a field that's still very much developing, but for now we can identify several characteristics. First, species that reproduce at a young age and reproduce frequently and produce many small seeds or can reproduce vegetatively are more likely to become invasive than other species. This is likely because they're able to produce more seeds faster and therefore colonize disturbed areas where native species are maybe temporarily at a low abundance. This also links with the idea of propagule pressure that we're going to talk about in the next lecture. Second, species that are strong competitors are likely to be good invaders. In other words, they can take up resources more efficiently and or more quickly than other species. They're also more likely to become, species with these characteristics are also more likely to become invasive than other alien species. This is a characteristic that will allow a species to outcompete others and then replace them in the vegetation. Third characteristic, invasive species are often more plastic. Okay, and here, talking about plasticity, and that means that they're adaptable to conditions. So, for example, a good invader will be able to adapt to the conditions where it's transported to, even if those conditions are different from its native range. A related idea here that we also need to remember is that invasive species might not be very adaptable, but if they already have the ability to tolerate a wide range of conditions inherently, then they also could be a good invader. Fourth, invaders can sometimes be successful in the introduced ecosystem because they possess novel traits. In other words, they show characteristics that the native species in that system don't possess. For example, alien trees and shrub species that can withstand very cold temperatures are more likely to become invasive in the very cold High Drakensberg, since there are very few native woody species in the Drakensberg that can withstand these cold temperatures. In other words, those unique characteristics that allow alien species to occur in a niche that our native woody species can't, those characteristics allow them to be a successful invader. You can also think of, for example, novel characteristics like the ability to fix nitrogen or having a liana or creeper growth form. These could be traits that allow species to invade habitats where the native species don't have those same characteristics. Now, moving beyond biological traits, we see that a species is more likely to be invasive in a system where there are few closely related species. In other words, an alien species is more likely to do well where there are no native species from the same genus or family in the area where it's introduced. This likely reflects, in part at least, a higher possibility that the alien will have a trait that the native species don't, which in other words links with the idea of novel traits. But this also likely relates to the species being less likely to have any specialist herbivores or pathogens in that ecosystem. And we'll talk about the enemy release hypothesis, which is related to this in the next lecture. Species with larger ranges in their native distribution also tend to be more successful invaders. And this probably reflects these species have broad environmental tolerances, which links with what we've already spoken about. But it also likely means that the species seeds have a greater chance of being transported by humans, since there will be more opportunities for people to interact with that plant in its native distribution if the plant occurs in many species. You can well imagine a plant that only occurs in one small forest on some isolated island, it would be very unlikely that that species is going to be spread by humans, simply because fewer humans are interacting with it. Okay, so that is some good, broad, general principles about what makes a good invader. Let's have a look at one specific example. So we've already seen Lantana camara has distribution along South Africa's east coast and in the eastern interior. And we've seen that as very high densities in some parts of South Africa. So why is the species so successful? Well, we can identify a couple of reasons. First, it's a good disperser that manages to spread its fruit and obviously the seeds inside the fruit quite far. It does this by having fleshy fruits that attract birds, and they can spread the seeds in over large distances. But interestingly, these seeds are specifically adapted to bird dispersal by being toxic to many mammals. Okay? And this is interesting because the mammals are more likely to destroy the seed within the fruit. So this toxicity to mammals is an interesting way to reduce the potential for mammals to damage the seeds. Lantana also handles disturbances well and can regrow rapidly after damage. And the plants are also covered with irritating trichomes, in other words, hairs on the leaves and stems. And they also have short but very strong thorns. And these also give greater protection against disturbances by animals. In other words, they're less likely to be disturbed. When they are disturbed or damaged, they can regrow quickly. Lantana also has a clever trick in that it produces chemicals that can suppress some other plant species. This is called allelopathy. And it makes Lantana a better competitor, because it can have this negative effect on its competitors. Finally, Lantana also produces fairly large and colorful flowers over a long period each season. And this means it's got a good chance of being pollinated, and it also means that it attracts gardeners who enjoy its beautiful flowers and have therefore historically spread their species across much of the world. So I'd recommend you pause the video here and to think a minute about how these characteristics of Lantana match up with the general characteristics we've talked through in the previous slide. Okay, before we move from invasiveness to invasibility, I want you just to have a look at this figure still. This graph summarizes the results from 59 studies that have compared 64 alien species with their closest native relatives. Okay, so at a site we can compare an alien species and a closely related native species, and we can identify the characteristics that the invasive species show more often than their native counterparts. Okay, and on this graph, we could therefore say that the traits above the red line are traits that are associated with invasiveness. I'm going to ask each of you to pause the video here and have a careful read through this yourself, and to think about, again, how these traits fit with the general ideas we listed 2 slides ago. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. We have an idea now of what makes a species a good invader. But what makes an ecosystem vulnerable to actually being invaded? In other words, what ecosystem characteristics can give an area high invasibility? This is also a topic that's still incompletely understood, but I can highlight for you at least a few characteristics. First, areas that experience frequent or intense disturbances, especially of the type that native species aren't well adapted to. These areas tend to be more invaded than other systems. Systems with high resource availability are also typically more invasible than species with less resources available. And there's obviously a nice strong link between these two characteristics. Since disturbances often temporarily increase resource availability, because that disturbance removes lots of the competing plants, and therefore there's less species around to take up the resources. So there's this temporary increase in resource availability. For me, the classic example here would be flooding along rivers. And you can see this when you look at the small rivers flowing through Pretoria. Each time that there's a flood and big trees get killed and other plants get ripped out of the ground and sediments from higher up get deposited lower down on the river, that combination of removing competitors and increasing resource availability creates an excellent opportunity for fast-growing aliens with lots of seeds to establish in that environment. The other general rule related to invasibility and abiotic factors is that extreme conditions generally have fewer invasives than milder habitats. For example, we see a decline in the richness of alien species as we move up Sony Pass. So the lowlands with moderate temperatures have got a fairly high number of invasive plants. But once we reach the top of the pass, where winter conditions are very cold, we see a lot fewer alien species. One worrying idea here is that with climate change, it might allow alien species now to invade higher up into these mountains, or more generally, just to invade into areas that are becoming less severe. There are also biotic factors that influence invasibility, with humans being a key biotic influence. Our presence increases disturbances and also increases resource availability. We also obviously transport plants around and are a key part of the spread phase of alien species. Non-human animals, and especially we're thinking of large mammals here, can also create disturbances that favor the establishment of aliens. What about other plant species? Well, it looks like generally competition from native plant species will reduce invasibility. In other words, make it harder for alien species to establish and survive. I'll talk more about this idea in the next lecture when we think about the biotic resistance hypothesis. Finally, it's important to note that everywhere is invasible, right? There are just different degrees of invasibility. So you could maybe argue that surely Antarctica isn't invasible, but even there are invasive species. When comparing geographic regions broadly, one of the patterns which does also stick out is that islands are generally more invasible than continents. Okay, let's now zoom in specifically to South Africa to consider invasion biology in our context. There are at least 1,880 known alien species in South Africa, with there likely being hundreds, if not thousands more species that have already been introduced but are yet unrecorded. These species arrive in South Africa chiefly for commercial reasons, forestry, agriculture, horticulture, sometimes also the pet trade. There are many species that are also accidentally introduced too. Most alien species in South Africa are located close to our urban areas, as you can see on the map there with the darker areas, with the highest alien plant species richness in the Western Cape and along the southern and eastern coasts and the interior of the east, so in other words, Gauteng and Mpumalanga. This just breaks down the alien species into different groups, and you can see that plants, the top bar there, are the most species-rich group of invaders in South Africa, followed by insects and other invertebrates. In terms of their impacts, and this might surprise you, but we only have formal investigations of the impacts of about 10% of the alien plant species that we know occur in South Africa. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So of those 200 odd species that have been formally assessed, we know that at least 7 have massive environmental impacts. And of these 7, only 2 are plant species and the other 5 are fish species. So far this doesn't sound too bad, with only 7 species with very serious impacts. But I think actually the message that we need to take here is that there's still a lot of research and a lot of assessments that have to be done before we actually know what the effects of these alien species are. A more accurate measure of the impacts of alien species in South Africa may be how much they cost. And we've already spoken about this a little bit. But I think it's interesting to note that it's been estimated that invasive species cost us 34 billion rand in terms of water loss and declines in water quality, and potentially another 2 billion in terms of livestock production. So instead of saying that there are only 7 species that have massive ecological or environmental impacts, I think thinking about those costs is also a useful way to make sure that we don't underestimate the impacts. Now, I definitely don't expect you to memorize the details of this table, but I want you to understand the main message here. This table lists a few examples of how invasive species affect ecosystem services and ecosystem goods. In other words, how alien plants not necessarily affect biodiversity, but how they directly impact on the quality of life for us humans. From the first column, you can see that alien plants affect the diversity of processes and resources that we as humans rely on. And I'd suggest you just pause the video for a minute here and have a look through this slide. And then the next two slides will illustrate some case studies for you. The water hyacinth, Iconia crassipes, occurs in freshwater bodies and is a pest in several dams, especially here in the Highveld, including, for example, the Hartebees Dam. Now, this plant forms a mat that covers the top of the water surface, and it reduces the light in the water, resulting in less phytoplankton and less dissolved oxygen, and therefore fewer fish. And obviously, these dams are used for human recreation, and you can imagine you're not going to be able to enjoy a dam that's covered in water hyacinth like this. Another example would be black wattle, Acacia learnsii, which is a common invader in South Africa's grasslands. This tree species alters microclimatic conditions by creating lots of shade, and it lowers grazing availability by suppressing grasses, and it can severely alter the characteristics of fires in the grasslands. And this is a particularly tricky species to manage because it produces very large seed banks. In other words, there are tens of hundreds of thousands of seeds of the species in the soil, even within a square meter. It can, however, and this is where we need to start balancing the social, the economic, and the ecological impacts, this species can, however, be an important source of firewood in areas where native tree species are maybe quite rare or slow growing. Let's deal with one more South African specific topic before we wrap up. Our national legislation that's related to alien plant species, specifically the National Environmental Management Act that deals with biodiversity. Call it NEMBA for short. Now, NEMBA lists 550 alien species that have been assigned a legal status, with that number including more than 380 alien plant species. These alien species are grouped into one of three categories, and the species in the first of these categories, category 1, are declared weeds. Declared weeds here means species that must be controlled or eradicated. Ideally, this species should be entirely removed from our ecosystem, or at least needs to be managed to control its spread and impacts. It's worth remembering here that declared weeds are all alien species. So this is different from our definition of weeds from the start of this talk. Now, category 1 has two subgroups. 1B is reserved for the most serious invaders that are already established. Category 1A, on the other hand, is for emerging invaders. This means invasive species that still have small ranges and limited impacts, but which are thought to have the potential to become much more serious invaders in the future and have greater impacts in the future. Here on the left, we have a category 1A species, Cryptostegia grandiflora, the rubber vine, which still only occurs in a few handful of sites in South Africa, but which has the potential to invade massive areas, as it has already done in Australia and in some South American countries. On the right-hand side, we have Lantana camara, and this is really an excellent example of a category 1B species, as it's an established invasive with a large range and serious impacts. Category 2 and 3 species are legally termed plant invaders. And again, remember, this is slightly different from the ecological definition we spoke about earlier. This is the legal definition. But remember, if I'm asking about category 2 or 3 species, I'll make it clear that I'm talking about the legally termed plant invaders. So category 2 species are alien species that usually have commercial value, and they are then only allowed under specific circumstances that match those commercial values. This is an interesting category since it's trying to balance economic benefits versus ecological losses. Both of our examples here are bad invaders, pine trees and Acacia saligna, but they have the potential to become even more problematic in the future if they're not managed correctly now. Okay, so because they're category 2 species, they can still be cultivated, but only in limited circumstances. Category 3 species are mainly garden plants, and they are required to be managed so that they don't spread. So this means basically that these species can remain in your garden if they're already there, but it should not be possible for more individuals of that species to be grown in the future. For example, a category 3 species on the left here is Melia azadirach, the syringa. This is a species that if it's growing in your garden, it is allowed to remain there, but measures have to be taken to make sure that it doesn't spread further. And then, due to conflicting ecological, economic, and social pressures, we also get some rather complex combinations of the regulations. So, for example, jacaranda trees, which you can see on the bottom right of the slide, are listed as category 3 species by NEMBA, but they are category 1B species in Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga in the northwest. In other words, they need to be eradicated and are not listed for urban areas in these provinces. In other words, you're allowed to have jacaranda trees in Pretoria and plant them, but as soon as they move out of the urban areas, they have to be eradicated. Everywhere else outside of those provinces, they're category 3, meaning that you can grow them, but you're not allowed to let them reproduce. And there's one final addition here. If a jacaranda tree occurs within 50 meters of a farmhouse and was already large at the time when the NEMBA regulations were published, then that tree, as long as it's not in a riparian area, then that species, then that individual doesn't need to be eradicated. So you can see that it can be quite complicated for some species. Fortunately, the listings are pretty clear for the majority of the species. And you've got to remember that this is a legal framework that can be enforced and can be implemented. And indeed, there are now starting to be court cases where this is enforced. Okay, let's wrap up here for now. After this video, you should understand the difference between alien invasive species, and you need to be able to describe the invasion process, naming the various stages and the various barriers. You should also be able to discuss the broad impacts of invasive species and predict which species are more likely to be invasive and which ecosystems are more likely to become invaded. You also need to understand the difference between the NEMBA alien species categories. I look forward to you joining me for the next lecture, where we're going to continue with this topic, digging into some more advanced concepts and theories that can help us to forecast invasions and to identify appropriate management actions.